Hello, my name is Alicia Middleman. I'm a curator at the Estes Park Museum. Today is April 2nd, 2014. We're at the Estes Park Museum about to interview Paige Claassen for the Estes Valley Mountaineering Oral History Project, a joint project between the Estes Valley Library and the Estes Park Museum. Could you state your full name, please?
My name is Paige Claassen.
And when and where were you born?
I was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1990.
And when did you move to Colorado?
I moved to Colorado when I was 2 years old in 1992.
And then when did your family come to Estes Park?
My family moved from Parker, Colorado to Estes Park when I was between 3rd and 4th grade.
And what was your first introduction to climbing?
Well, it's kind of a funny story. I was really bad at all the activities I tried. So I was in the swim program for a while. I tried soccer, I tried saxophone, and my parents were just like, we have to find something that she's good at because this is tough. And so they took me to the climbing gym. They saw an advertisement in the newspaper, and at that time it was the gym downtown. And I just loved it right away, and that was kind of my thing from then on. And I started in the after-school program and began competing right away. Within my first year, I went to national championships in Michigan, and I just loved competing, and it took off from there.
Okay, so your first introduction to climbing was at the climbing gym on Elkhorn Avenue. Do you remember that first day in there? Was it overwhelming?
I remember the first day in the gym, I tried the beginner wall where they start everyone off on the top ropes. And I loved that, but I really wanted to try the wall with a roof. And they were like, well, we don't really put beginners on that. But I was eager and I wanted to try. And of course I didn't make it over the roof, but I wasn't afraid of falling from the beginning, so would just swing around. And I think maybe my cousins were even there that day. So it was just like a fun family day of everyone playing. And that's kind of what climbing was to me at that time, was playtime. And it still kind of is to some extent.
You mentioned getting into competitive climbing right away. Can you explain what climbing in a competition is?
Sure. So in a climbing competition, it's not based on speed, it's actually based on difficulty. So there will be really challenging routes, and ideally, they want one person to reach the top and everyone else to fall lower and lower. So your goal is to get as high as you can, but most likely you'll fall at some point. But for me, I began competing in the after-school program, so it was just against kids in Estes. And I remember tying for first with some boys, and that was like a big confidence boost for me, in where it kind of became this game. And I was very competitive both with myself and with other people, and that motivated me to travel throughout the country and later throughout the world to compete. And it was just, I liked the pressure that I felt from competitions, both from myself and from what I perceived to be from the audience, even though in reality, they don't really care how you do. And my parents were going to love me regardless of how I placed. But I liked having to perform in front of a group of people, but at climbing, not singing or something like that I had had bad experiences with in the past.
I see. So to be clear, you were climbing behalf of the Estes Park climbing team?
In the national competitions?
Yeah, when you were really young.
Well, climbing's a very individual sport, so especially at that time, people weren't really climbing for a team, you just climbed as an individual. So I practiced with the Estes Park climbing team, but then at competitions, I was really just representing myself, as all of the other kids were. Now competitions are still very individual, but kids do compete for their team, and the team also gets a score, but it's still very individual.
What was training like with the team?
Training with a team was like just hanging out with your friends. It was really fun, it was social. I was the youngest person on the team by quite a bit, so I had this great group of mentors who were very kind in putting up with me because I think I had a lot of energy. And it was just this really supportive group of people And what I've kind of always loved about climbing is that it's sort of a place where people who didn't fit in elsewhere can go. Maybe they didn't like team sports or something didn't work out in other places and they landed in climbing because you're responsible for both your successes and your failures. So it's very based on self-motivation and being an individual. And so I think that's attractive to a lot of people. But despite that individuality that you have in climbing, being part of the team was just fun. And we had coaches who would bring games that we played to train. And it was like a little family. And that's why climbing is really cool for me. And you traveled pretty far for some of these comps. You mentioned going to Michigan. Where else were some of the competitions? Those first few years I competed in nationals in Michigan, in Virginia, California, Oregon, and I was really blessed to have a family who could support my travels, and my family's always been a big part of my life in climbing. And both my parents and my younger brother, who he climbs as well, were able to travel with me across the nation and across the world. So that was something that I was really fortunate to have, was a family who could support that and who was excited to see me compete and to cheer me on. So
I can't imagine that those competitions always took place during school breaks. Did you have to balance travel with school here in Estes Park?
Definitely. When it's the youth program, they actually do a pretty good job of making nationals and world championships in the summer because it's all kids competing. But then as you get into adult competitions and local competitions, they're on the weekends, they're far away. And so there is that balance of school and climbing, and especially in high school and then later in university. It was difficult. And I think my senior year of high school, I missed over 60 days of school. So it was, again, that self-motivation where you have to be self-motivated to train as a climber, but you also have to make up for all your schoolwork, and that was hard at times.
Who were your coaches in Estes Park, and what are some of the things that they taught you?
My first coach in Estes was Jim Dahlstrom. He was part of the after-school program, and so he really introduced me to climbing. And I remember I was really afraid of lead climbing when I first started and falling on lead. And so I remember a time in the gym where Jim Dahlstrom had me climb up, and then I got to the top, and he gave me this really big fall that I wasn't expecting. And that kind of just snapped something in my head that, okay, I'm safe. I didn't want that fall, but here I am, and I can do that again and again. And so I built up that comfort level to falling. I also had Mike Caldwell, Stephen Greenway, and Michelle Herney as coaches throughout my time on the Estes Park climbing team. And each of those coaches played a really important role in my climbing life, in learning to compete and be a good competitor, in learning to use good footwork, motivation, eating well, having fun, getting along with team members, all of those things that you do build up in team sports. There's a different dynamic in climbing, but each of those coaches was so supportive and just a really positive role in my life, and it's fun to keep up with them today too, and to be able to follow each other and look back on those times that we had together.
It must be really rewarding for them to see your progress too. Can you recall how old you were or what year that was that you began leading in the gym?
I think I began climbing when I was 9, and I think I began leading maybe when I was 10. So pretty soon. It was in the old gym downtown. So that's something that's really important to climbing, whether you're inside or outside, is you need to be able to lead. And it's really good for your head too, because it forces you into this whole other mental level where you have to be thinking about safety and where the rope is and what your fall might be like. And so that was an important time for me.
Okay, then at some point you transitioned into climbing outdoors. When was that, and what compelled you to climb outside?
So I had tried climbing outside quite a few times when I was really young. Our coaches would take us up to the Thumb on Prospect Mountain or out to Lumpy Ridge, to Jurassic Park. And honestly, it never really clicked for me. I was like, I like the gym and I like competing. And that's kind of embarrassing now as someone who now loves the outdoors and climbing outside. But when I was young, the gym was where I was comfortable. And outside, you had to eat gross power bars all day, and you had to wait in line for top ropes, and you had to wear a helmet and all of this stuff that when you're little isn't cool. And so we went out a few times, and it was fun, but it wasn't my thing. And my parents are also big into the outdoors. They don't climb, but we would go on family hikes, and I think those always involved a lot of complaining about, oh, we have to go on a hike again. But then my family went with Stephen Greenway to Shelf Road and later to Rifle, both in Colorado. And those trips taught me that climbing could be fun. And at that point, I was able to lead. I could try routes that were physically challenging to me, which I think really made me love climbing outside, where it wasn't just doing laps on rocks, it was actually trying hard. And that's what I love about climbing, is pushing myself. And I like approaching moves and thinking they're impossible and then having to work on them over and over until you can do them, and then you can do the whole route. And so those experiences in some places that weren't at home, I think also allowed me to kind of get out of my little zone here and to try harder.
When did those trips take place to Shelf Road and to Rifle?
Those trips took place when I was about 15 or 16. So it was later in high school when I decided to really climb outside more and start trying hard projects. And then when I was about 19 or 20, I decided that I didn't want to compete anymore. And at that point, I had competed for 10 or 11 years all throughout the world. And I had loved it, but to really do your best in those world competitions, you need to train in the gym all the time. And moreover, you need to train in Europe, where they have these very specific gyms. And that wasn't where I wanted to spend my time. And to spend so much money to go to Europe for these competitions, and you're climbing for like 10 minutes for one trip to Europe. And so that didn't quite seem worth it to me. And my passion for climbing outside was growing. And so I just made this decision where I don't want to straddle both and be so-so at both competition climbing and outdoor climbing, but I really want to focus on climbing outside. So.
Does the pressure grow in the competitive world as you get a little older?
I definitely think the pressure grows as you get older. When I was young, I never got nervous. I loved the pressure, but then as you do better and better, you're kind of expected to do well all the time. And again, it's that thing where it's really personal pressure, because those people watching and those people cheering for you, they're proud of you either way. They don't care how you do. They want you to do well. But I think it was really this personal pressure where I had done well in competitions, and so I knew what I was capable of, and I needed to uphold that level at every competition. And I think another thing for me was that as the competition scene was growing and climbing is such a small community, the dynamic between girls changes, and it got kind of catty where these are your friends, like they're the only other women around you climbing, but they're also your competitors. And so to maintain those friendships sometimes was really difficult. And I had not a falling out, but some tension with one of my closest friends over competition because we were getting to that same level. And both of us kind of realized what was going on at the same time and transitioned our focus back to climbing outside. And now we're really close friends again. But it's a strange dynamic in such a small community where girls can really get in each other's faces. And that wasn't something that I wanted to be a part of. But also knowing that it's part of competition, that you're competing against maybe your friends.
Yeah, that's a lot to juggle at that age. And what's interesting to me is with some of the older men that we've interviewed, Oftentimes there was one female or a couple at the scene, and really we haven't yet heard of there being more women there and them and their dynamics.
I bet. I'm interested to hear about their stories too.
Yeah. So then when you began climbing outside, what were some of your initial projects in the Estes Park area?
Initially, when I began climbing outside, I was going to like real sport areas, like rifle, that had tons of bolts, things weren't run out, it was very comfortable. And so that kind of bridged the gap between the gym and the crag. And that was a nice transition because it allowed me to learn how to be safe, how to climb outside respectfully, respect the environment, be a good ambassador for the sport. But then as I began to climb outside more and more, my focus kind of drifted back to Estes, and I realized, I grew up in this place where there's rock everywhere. And when I was going to school down at CU, I didn't really have time to travel to too many different places. So my objectives were more focused at home. And one place that really attracted my attention was the monastery out by Glen Haven. And the first day I went there, I tried a route called the Quickening. It's 13C, I think, and I just loved it. And I loved the style there. It was really thin and technical, which is something that not many modern climbers really like. A lot of the younger climbers now like really steep caves, really powerful climbing, really physical climbing. But I was still attracted to those thin technical routes, and that was what the monastery was. And the monastery is in this beautiful location where in the vestibule, you're located in this little corridor that perfectly lines up Long's Peak. So there's not many people up there. You're kind of just with your group of friends, and you have this gorgeous view of Long's. And that was a really special time for me, spending time at the monastery, because I was kind of in my home area, but I was actually having fun outside, which was a new-ish experience for me. And I decided that I wanted to work on some of the other routes up there, and I began working on Grand Ole Opry. And it took about, I think, 4 to 5 weeks for me to do that. And in the beginning, I was really just playing on the route. I wanted to try the moves. I thought, if nothing else, I'll get stronger. And as I played around, I couldn't do a lot of the moves, but it sort of felt possible. And I remember a conversation with a friend in the car where they said, "Do you want to do this route?" And I thought about it, and I said, "Yes, I do, and I'm going to do it." And at that point, I absolutely knew that I would finish the route because I had said it out loud. And as soon as I had made that commitment verbally, I couldn't let myself back out. So I continued to work on Grand Ole Opry, and it was the traditional process of projecting where at first you're having fun and you're making progress each day, and then you begin to make downward progress, and then you're frustrated, and then you think, oh, I can never do this. This is impossible for me. I'm not strong enough. And it's this whole mental battle, which is really quite miserable, but it's what I love. And so it's this strange relationship of going through all those emotions and then in the end conquering them and knowing that it was worth it. And when I did Grand Ole Opry, it was a turning point for my climbing because I realized what I was capable of, and that if I put enough time and effort into something, I could do things that didn't feel possible. And I could do moves that after 10 or 20 tries, I still couldn't even fathom sticking that hold. But if I kept working on it, it would come together. So the monastery definitely holds a special place in my heart. And after Grand Ole Opry, I went back to complete the other routes up there. There's still a 512 gear route that I have to do. So kind of my goal this summer is to get more comfortable placing gear, and that's my last route in the vestibule.
Can you tell me what it's called?
I don't even know the name of the 512.
That's okay. This is really remarkable for me because just a week prior, Tommy Caldwell was sitting right where you are, and he talked about climbing the Grand Ole Opry and how initially he thought it was impossible too. And he gave it a year, even 2, before he returned to that area to really give it a good effort. So and you were the first female to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And did you think about him and Mike Caldwell since you knew them personally?
Definitely. Tommy played a pretty important role in my life through climbing because Mike was my coach when I was young, and so I remember Tommy coming into the gym to sign posters for our team. And honestly, I was so young that climbing celebrities, I just wanted to climb on the wall. So there was no like being starstruck or whatever because I was almost too young for that. But I remember having this poster of Tommy Caldwell on to Bolt, and I was like, he is Spider-Man because he is climbing a wall where there's no holds. He's just sticking to the drywall. And so I kind of remembered walking around like my house after that and looking at blank walls and being like, that's Tommy Caldwell on to Bolt or not to be. And that was the one route that in my adult life I was like, I have to do that route because of that poster of Tommy. And then in years following that, to be able to revisit some of Tommy's routes, and especially Grand Ole Opry, is really cool because he made such an impact on climbing in Colorado. And so many of the hardest sport routes here are Tommy's routes. And that's really cool. There's a list of, he has the most impressive tick list in rock climbing, in my opinion, because he does so many different aspects of the sport. And no one else has really done that, where they have impressive bouldering ascents and sport climbing and gear routes and alpine climbs and big walls. So now that I can actually appreciate all that Tommy's done, it's so cool to follow his ascents and look back on his history through climbing.
Wow. I'm hoping you can expand a little bit on the process where in Grand Ole Opry you said there's this natural progression of working on it, getting through some of the moves, and then kind of going backwards, almost regressing.
Sure.
How do you not give up on it and walk away?
I think part of it is my personality. I'm very determined, and I feel like I can kind of tell when I can do something. And it might not be easy or come quickly or come as easily and quickly as I want it to, but giving up feels like defeat to me. And I think in climbing where, especially when you're not competing, you're just competing against yourself. So if you give up, if you walk away, you're losing the game. And there's nothing wrong with that at times. There's times when you need to walk away. And I've done that from other projects where it just becomes self-deprecating and you're just defeated over and over and you're worn down and you need to step back and try something else. But with almost every hard route I've worked on, there's been that like emotional roller coaster. And I've talked to women about it, I've talked to men about it, and I think for both men and women it can be very emotional. And there's lots of people who think like crying at the cliff is ridiculous, and it does have a ridiculousness to it. But there would be times when I was so frustrated that I would sit at the bottom of the cliff just sobbing like a small child. And there's no excuses for that, but that was my way of expressing frustration. And some people will fall and scream and kick and throw their shoes, but mine was just like curling into this ball and feeling defeated. But once you get over that and you look back up at the route, and I feel like I try and choose routes that are beautiful and inspire me beyond just, I want to climb this difficulty. So when you see those holds and you look back at the route's history and how many people have tried it and couldn't overcome it or didn't continue to try it, it just kind of fuels your desire. And so for me, it was an important goal that I wanted to achieve, and I wasn't willing to give up on that.
Are there any other areas in Estes Park that hold such a special place to you, like the monastery does?
As of now, the monastery is where I've spent the most time around Estes. I've spent a bit of time up at Wizard's Gate, which is an area that Jonathan Segrist developed, and I'd like to finish off some of those routes. I think that's a really cool area that's a bit unique to Estes because it actually has some slightly steeper climbs like the monastery. A lot of the climbs around Estes are more slabby, vertical, And there's a lot of gear routes, which is something that I haven't really been into yet. And like I said, that's something that I want to work on this summer, because as of now, I'm a sport climber and I clip bolts, but I would really like to learn to place gear and be comfortable placing gear, to actually try hard trad routes. And I think that will be a point where I can really explore more of Estes. I would love to do the diamond. Tommy's established some really cool hard routes of that. But before I even think about that, I think I just need to try an easy one and do the diamond. So I have some goals around Estes that I haven't explored yet, but it's really fun to be able to think of what's in my backyard. And previously, I was looking to areas like Rifle or Spain and France where they're sport climbing havens. And I wouldn't call Estes a sport climbing haven per se. But there are so many opportunities that I want to take advantage of in the future.
Do you ever think about route development?
I have thought a bit about route development, and I've asked a few friends to show me how to bolt, and so I've done some bolting on river rocks in the backyard just to practice. But I think that's a really cool opportunity as well, because there aren't many women developing, and that's something that I would like to try in the future, and that definitely requires some mentorship, because you don't want to just go out there and go for it. But that is something that is attractive to me, and you just have to find the right line that, or for me, I would want to find the right line that is inspiring and feels worth that time and effort, and then to be able to learn to appreciate the route developers of the past that have done so much to develop our sport. And I think that's really important, especially with this younger generation, because I think a lot of times, myself included, we just climb because it's fun, and we don't really think about all the effort that others put into developing these routes. And I don't think you can fully appreciate that until you do it yourself. So almost more than anything, I want to try bolting so that I can appreciate and thank those who came before me.
Yeah, and you probably didn't really run into the issue, the controversial issue of bolting back when it was coming up, and the Caldwells, for example, took some heat for it.
Right.
And so did you ever get any flack for being a sport climber specifically?
Not exactly. I remember climbing at even some of the smaller home gyms in Estes, and everyone had stickers that, what did they say? Trad is rad and sport climbing is neither. And I remember when I was little just being like, sport climbing is climbing, that's what climbing is. And I think that's kind of the ignorance of the younger generation, is this is what this sport is, and we fail to recognize all the other facets of the sport. But no, I haven't received flack personally for being a sport climber, but I haven't been a developer, so I haven't really been involved in a lot of those conflicts. And there are so many important moral issues to consider in developing routes, whether you're bolting or just establishing new gear routes, and is it safe, and have you cleaned it enough, and to what extent can you clean without manufacturing, and can gear be placed here, or should bolts be here to make it safe? There's so many questions involved that you do have to be really careful, and that's where I really want someone who's experienced to kind of guide me through those beginning steps, because it's important to not just go blast bolts everywhere. So.
And especially in Rocky Mountain National Park, people probably have to think about it even more so, because it requires hand drilling.
Exactly.
It's a lot of work.
Which is a whole nother story.
You spoke a little bit to some of those generational differences. I know that you've thought and spoke and written about falling. And some of the traditional climbers here went through rock climbing when there was an ethic that the leader doesn't fall, or if a route is too hard, then you just down climb. but then this generation kind of rising the ranks through indoor climbing and then some of the more moderates outdoors first. There's an ethic now where it's changed, where falling is okay. And can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. I'm definitely part of this generation where falling is not only okay, it's very necessary to climb at a certain level because, and it depends what you're looking for in the evolution of the sport, but if you're looking for evolution in grades and difficulty, falling is a huge piece, and no one's ever going to climb harder if they're not falling, and not even just falling, but there's this whole thing of you're basically aid climbing when you're projecting a sport route. You're clipping into the wall, you're pulling on draws, you're like using a stick clip to get the next bolt in some cases. I don't really like doing that, but it's kind of aid climbing. And so it's very strange that, especially a lot of younger climbers, I think, would say, oh, I would never aid climb. Like, that's such a ridiculous part of the sport. But that's what we're doing. And so I think you kind of have to bring it back to this point that we're all climbing rocks, which is a little bit silly in itself. And there's so many different means of doing that. So it's like you choose your method of getting up the rock. But for me, that's why I almost have trouble getting into trad climbing, is because falling is so ingrained in climbing for me. And I'm really comfortable falling because I'm falling on bolts. And so to kind of switch that mental piece where you can't really fall in some cases, that's really hard for me because I like the challenge of just throwing yourself at moves and knowing you're coming off the wall, but maybe your goal is to just get an inch higher each time, or for your hand to touch the hold or whatever it is, and knowing that you're going to fall, and then slowly working up to hopefully not falling and then definitely not falling. It's a strange process.
Yeah, so with the example of the Grand Ole Opry, which is a 514C, falling was a big part of accomplishing that route.
Definitely. With Grand Ole Opry, one of the reasons I really like it is because I wouldn't say it's run out, but you can't reach between bolts. So you actually have to climb between bolts, which I find really cool because in a lot of sport areas, you can just pull yourself up route. So it doesn't matter how hard you can climb, you can get to the top of a 514. But with Grand Ole Opry, if you couldn't do the crux move, you're not trying the rest of it. And I did work it on top rope a few times before I did it on lead because I couldn't even attempt the moves. They were so hard for me that leading wasn't really even an option, or I couldn't try. But I do remember taking some really big falls on Grand Ole Opry where you have to skip a bolt at one point in the middle of the crux and then jump for this big top, and then you can clip below you. But taking that fall is pretty exciting. And you just have to get comfortable with it and trust your belayer and know that you're safe, and if you don't go for it, you're never going to catch that next hold. So it's a strange balance of you can't really be afraid, because if you're afraid, then you're more likely to fall because you're not committing. And I like that aspect as well.
You said a little bit that climbing rocks is a little silly by its nature, but I can think of some times where I've heard you take topics or themes from climbing and apply it in a broader sense that appeals to more people beyond climbers, like falling isn't failing. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So climbing, to me, is a very selfish sport because we're just doing it for ourselves, and maybe if you're a developer, you're contributing to the community, the climbing community, which is still a small group of people. But I think what's really cool about climbing is that it can relate to other parts of life, and climbing has helped me as an individual so much. When I was 9 and started climbing, I had no confidence. I couldn't even talk to people really because I was so shy. There's actually a story where I won a bicycle in 4th grade through a raffle, and they called my name over the intercom, and I went to the school office crying because I was humiliated that they had announced my name over the intercom. But climbing gave me that confidence where I am good at something. If I work hard at something, it can become attainable. And that's a message that I do want to share with other people, is that persistence and determination and working hard will pay off. And that's something that got me through high school when I was missing a lot of school. And it got me through university when classes are hard and exams are hard, and you're still trying to balance climbing and traveling. And climbing just taught me that the effort I put in is the result I will get out of it. And that you will have to make sacrifices along the way. And that, especially as a teenager, I didn't party. That wasn't my thing. I wanted to climb, and I needed to go to school. And so that left not a lot of time for a social life. But that was a sacrifice that I was willing to make. And I think in all aspects of life, we kind of have to prioritize, and we have to choose what's important and where we're going to put our hard work in. And so that is a topic that I like to share in some of my talks. And also, climbing is just a great metaphor for life. I mean, we're overcoming obstacles, we're climbing up to the top, we're falling along the way. And maybe you're trying to get into school or interview for a new job, and it might not work out the first time. You might keep falling, but knowing that those are steps on the ladder to reaching that goal, and that without those failures, maybe you're not pushing yourself hard enough. And that's kind of a theme that I've tried to live by, is that if I'm succeeding all the time, I'm probably not trying hard enough.
Wow. With your work with nonprofits and climbing objectives, what do you envision for your future? What would you like to see happen?
It's kind of hard to envision the future. I feel like I'm still so young that it's so hard to decide what you want to be when you grow up. And I struggled with that a lot in university, what I would major in, because that would determine the rest of my life. And now I realize that, people change career paths when they're 40 or 50, and that's fine. But right now, I just finished up a world tour where I was climbing in different countries to raise money for nonprofit organizations. And that taught me a lot about how I can use climbing in a positive way, where climbing itself might be this somewhat selfish activity, but it's like people running marathons to raise money for breast cancer awareness. You can kind of use what you're good at, and if people want to watch videos or read media, and then you can slip another message in there to inform people about the amazing work that so many people are doing around the world, and about those that really need help. And throughout that trip, I really learned what's out there in the world about different cultures, and how people can manage to keep such a positive attitude despite their circumstances. And that taught me so much, and that's something that I would like to keep expanding on in the future, and work with different organizations that especially help younger kids, because like I said, climbing taught me so much when I was young, and it gave me that confidence to push myself and to be driven. And I think that when you're young, you can chase after those dreams that might seem silly to other people, but if that's what motivates you each day, it's worth it. And climbing might not be accessible to all little kids around the world. It's not an accessible sport. But if there's something that they love and they're passionate about, it's important to use that as motivation to try hard in school, and to surround yourself with the right people, and to work towards those goals. So I think there are a lot of people out there starting organizations with even local gyms in the US that are helping kids to kind of find out who they are, because that's hard when you're young. There's a lot of pressure to, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like, act the right way and be the right person, and climbing's something that can kind of help you find that.
Sure. And during your world tour, you've coupled the fundraising and kind of experiencing these cultures with some climbing. And you picked some really bold objectives in these places that are really not traveled to so much by foreign climbers. What were some of the highlights of your climbing around the world?
As far as the climbing goes, it was really cool to be in so many unique places, and that was kind of the goal with choosing somewhat different locations, was for each month the rock to be very different, the objective to be very different, to always be trying new things. And at times that was really hard because maybe you're going from one area that requires a ton of endurance and finger strength, and then next month you're trying this really short route where you need a lot of bouldering power. And so it was hard to adapt my body to that each month. But there were definitely some moments that stood out. I got to do my first ascent in South Africa, which would be even strange to some of the other people you've interviewed, but I didn't bolt it. One of the local guys in South Africa bolted it, and he was like, I'd really like you to try this route because it seems your style. You like Smith Rock and you like that technical style of climbing, and this is too hard for me and I want you to try it. And I did, and I think it was the most beautiful route I've ever tried. And that was again one of those times where at moments it felt impossible, but I really wanted to do it. And in the end, ended up doing the first ascent of that route in South Africa. I think it's about 14A, but I'd like other people to go test it out too.
It's a 514A, and can you pronounce it?
Yes, Digital Warfare. It's a 514A in South Africa. Some other moments that stood out were in Italy. I did a slab that was graded 14B. Only one guy had done it before, and no one really likes slab climbing anymore, it seems. But I love slabs. They're so much fun. And again, it's like a mental puzzle. And in Italy, it was raining almost all month, so the slab was wet a lot of the time, and it was just gross conditions. And in the end, it came together on the second to last day of the trip, and at that point, I had totally given up. And one of my mantras in climbing has been, if you keep trying and you believe you can do it, you can. And Italy was different because I had totally given up, and I didn't believe I could do it at all. I was just trying so that I didn't have excuses on the way home. I couldn't say, oh, if only I had tried it once more. And then suddenly it came together in like this miracle moment when it was like lightly raining outside and not good slab conditions. But I had put all that effort in and I knew how to do the moves. And so again, you kind of, throughout your life, you have these little moments that the world, or for me, God, reminds me that like why I'm there, why I'm doing this. And that was one of those times where it was like, just keep trying.
Wow. Do you think being raised in this environment in Estes Park lent itself well at all as preparation for the variety of climbing you would do around the world?
I definitely think that growing up in Estes inspired the style of climbing that I like, because despite the fact that when I was young and didn't like slab climbing up on Lumpy Ridge as a 10-year-old, it kind of ingrained this history of climbing in me that I wanted to continue learning about as an adult. And I think it's also a lot of the things my coaches taught me through climbing, the importance of footwork. And it wasn't all about being the strongest climber you could be. It wasn't all about having huge biceps, but it was about learning good technique and actually being a good climber, not just a strong climber. And that's something that stuck with me and that I'm appreciative to my coaches for. And now I'm excited to be able to apply around Estes for the rest of my life in climbing.
Are there any other people you looked up to? You talked about Tommy. Are there any other examples of climbers you admired?
The climbers that I've always really admired are the people I'm climbing with every day. And I think that's something that's really cool, is that it doesn't have to be the strongest climber in the world to inspire you, but it's my everyday partners that try hard no matter what the grade is, and that push themselves and that encourage me. Those are the people that inspire me to continue climbing. So there weren't a ton of celebrity climbing figures in my life that motivated me to train harder, but it was more the people around me, the other kids on my team, my coaches, and my parents, even though they don't climb, because they were just so supportive of this thing that meant a lot to me, and in that way it meant a lot to them. And it really bound our family together too, because we were able to take some really special trips together and to share this activity that takes you outside and it takes you to strange places, and to be able to share that with your climbing partners or whoever you're around is really fun.
Did you ever have any close calls climbing outside?
I don't have any great stories about close calls. I think that probably comes from being a sport climber and starting in the gym. And that's something I'm really thankful for, is that I learned the safety rules of climbing in the gym, where it was a very controlled environment. I was learning from people who knew what they were doing at a very high level. So I had cleaned routes in the gym plenty of times before I ever did outside. And so I'm thankful that I haven't had those close calls outside. But a lot of it is doing those things that seem like they're for beginners, where you're checking each other's knots and you're asking if your belayer's ready. And that doesn't seem cool all the time, but it's so important. And I think we've seen a lot of really tragic climbing accidents over the past years that could have been prevented. And that's something that no matter how strong you are or how long you've been climbing, it's always worth to check out your equipment and what's around you. So that's something I try and do and hope that I can continue to do.
Good, I'm glad to hear that. Can you think of any challenges you've had to overcome to get to where you are today?
I think every day in climbing is a challenge in a way, because you're always presented with a new opportunity or a new challenge. And each route is different and forces you to push yourself in different ways. So you're never just honing in on this one skill. There's always so many things you have to focus on. And so that's a challenge in itself. I think I went through a time when I was maybe 16 or so, and I was like, I'm going to quit climbing. I'm sick of this. I don't want to do it anymore, and I'm going to play basketball. And my dad was like, oh gosh, this is going to be terrible, because I was so bad at sports with a ball or any other sports really. But I remember spending a few weeks practicing basketball in the driveway, and I didn't climb. And after a few weeks, it was like, all right, I'm ready to climb again. And that taught me that taking rests is not a bad thing. And so climbing's a sport where you're constantly practicing and you're constantly pushing your body, but it's really important to rest when you feel injured or unmotivated. And I think there's nothing wrong with taking time to do other things, because climbing's also a very consuming activity where kind of your whole life can start to revolve around this one thing: what you eat, what you do, what you talk about. And to remember that there are so many other cool things in life besides climbing is something that I've definitely had to learn over the years.
As a sponsored athlete, is that encouraged or frowned upon by your sponsors? How does that relationship work?
I'm really fortunate to work with brands who they're kind of like my family, and they're very understanding, and they're in it because they love it. And so my sponsors are very supportive of, you're feeling injured or you need rest, go for it. And I don't think that all athletes have that same experience, but I'm really thankful to my sponsors for all that they've helped me with, and just for the flexibility. And you as an athlete know what you need, and you have to do that, and you have to take care of yourself. So.
Have you, Paige, observed any changes in the climbing community in all the years that you've been climbing?
There's definitely been a lot of changes in the climbing community. I think in youth climbing, especially, when I started climbing, there were a few defined teams, but it was different. The teams were having fun, and you were training, but there wasn't pressure from your team, and you weren't being like beaten to exhaustion. And I see some of these youth teams now, and it's intense. And in some cases, I can't really imagine having a coach who is riding you that hard. And I know that's how it is in a lot of sports, but for me, I like being able to push myself. And my coaches push me, but they're also very supportive. And some of these young kids who are training with weight vests and some of the stuff where I'm just like, I lifted weights too heavy when I was young, and then I got elbow tendonitis. So I'm like, the weight vest thing is just a little painful. But I think there's pressure now to start when you're young and to be strong right away and to climb the same grade as your age. And these goals that just seem kind of oppressive when you're a kid who just wants to go to the playground. But at the same time, there's all these crazy strong little kids who seem to be having a blast, which is awesome. And I think that they've received a lot of criticism, like, oh, they're just climbing routes that are meant for small fingers, and it's because they're lighter. But it's cool to see these young kids who are pulling off routes that, 10 or 20 years ago didn't seem possible to anyone, let alone an 11-year-old. So I think that's the coolest evolution in the sport, is to see the next generation. And I'm still kind of a young generation, but to see people so much younger than me that are really passionate about climbing.
Talking about the evolution of the sport makes me think too about how the reputation of the climbing in our area has developed over the years. We have high peaks, we have crags, but now Rocky Mountain National Park is really coming on people's radar for bouldering.
Mm-hmm.
Do you share that enthusiasm for bouldering up here?
I don't boulder very much. I found that it's really hard on my body, and I don't really enjoy it as much as sport climbing, but it's something that's really necessary for training, and it's right here in my backyard. So I imagine this summer I'll probably spend more time in Rocky Mountain. But one thing that was really cool when traveling all around the world, everyone in the world knows about Rocky Mountain National Park, but it's because of bouldering, which is really interesting. And most of the climbers I was around were young. They were between 15 and 35. So they're kind of in this bouldering era. But they're like, oh yeah, we know about Rocky Mountain National Park. That's where some of the hardest boulders are. So it's interesting that among the younger generation, Estes is very well known, but not because of its history. So there are cool parts to that, but I think it's also important to recognize where we came from.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What do you say when they ask, have you climbed them?
Well, it would more be like, oh, where are you from? And I would say, I'm from Estes Park in Colorado, and everyone knew where Estes Park was from. And to me, I'm like, I grew up in this little mountain town of 7,000 people, but everyone knows it. And so yeah, I'm proud of where I came from, and that I do get to call this home, and that my parents still live here, and that I can return here all the time and invite friends from all over the world to come to my home and enjoy the same experiences that we all get to enjoy as locals.
Yeah. Paige, are there any, do you have any idea of what of any issues with accessibility or impact? Are those becoming bigger problems, bigger discussions among your generation? Are people concerned about it?
I definitely think access issues are huge right now, and becoming a bigger and bigger problem that I think younger people are actually starting to recognize more, and that's really cool to see people supporting the Access Fund and organizations who are trying to educate climbers on how to treat an area and to protect our existing areas and to help support future areas. And that's something when I was traveling, places around the world were trashed. I couldn't believe how much toilet paper was at the crag, and it was kind of heartbreaking. And it makes you feel really fortunate for these organizations that we have here in the States that do cleanup days. And it's important to participate in those days where you're supporting your local areas and to also set an example as a climber, because that's the best thing you can do is in a growing sport where new people are being introduced to climbing all the time, and some of them, they don't know what's okay and what's safe or what's good for the environment. And so to be an example is something really important and that I think younger climbers are catching on to, especially as these organizations try and reach out to younger generations and get younger climbers on board to then reach out to their own generation.
Yeah. Just a couple more questions. When you made that transition from indoor climbing to outdoor climbing, did you, and you started making friends who you could climb with outdoors and such, are there any differences between indoor and outdoor climbers?
I think there definitely are. I think when you come from the gym, hiking long approaches is less attractive. That's why rifle is really attractive to a lot of gym climbers because it is a gym. You park in the parking lot and you go climbing right there. Whereas I think a lot of hardcore outdoor climbers, they're like, oh, I did 2-3 hour approaches or 2 to 3 day approaches. So there are big differences, and I think that it's important for us all to learn from one another because I think the gym plays a very important role in preparing climbers for climbing outside, for training, but then the outdoors, of course, play an important role in just having a healthy lifestyle and enjoying what's all around us. So, yeah.
Okay. Are there any last stories you want to share?
I can't think of any.
Okay.
I feel like you asked really good questions.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, that was fun. Thank you.